rights. So this is so countercultural. It's not to say it was easy. I mean, there are instances of marriages breaking up. For example, a wife just did not want to send her little girl into Sabbath school with all these little black boys. But her husband was dedicated to this, and she left him over it. So it was not easy.
Welcome back to Advent Next, a theological podcast curated for curious faith discussions. This week we are talking with Dr. Douglas Morgan, author of the biography, Louis C. Sheafe, Apostle to Black America. Sheafe was an African-American pastor of the first Interracial SDA church in Washington, D.C. Sheafe was a revolutionary figure for his time, and Dr. Morgan seeks to dust off the records of history and place him in his rightful prominence as one of the most important leaders of the early church. Recommended reading for this week is Louis C. Sheafe, Apostle to Black America by Dr. Douglas Morgan. This program is part of a larger initiative to educate members on the history of the Black experience in the church. If you're not already following us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, be sure to find us at the handle @AdventNext. I'm your host, Kendra Arsenal, and this is Advent Next.
Well, I've been teaching in the history department at Washington Adventist University for several years, but currently I'm on leave from that, and I'm an assistant editor for the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, which is a new thing that's going to be coming online soon. My interests were really at the intersection of church history, Adventist history, race, as well as war and peace. And so I had read passing references to Sheafe in works by other Adventist historians, and they intrigued me. But there was not much there. I was invited to undertake research about the first church in Washington, D.C. Historic congregation, started out interracial. The daughter of Frederick Douglass, Rosetta Douglass Sprague, was a member. And that interested me, but I had no idea of the scope of what I would find. And in the course of that, I began to find more and more about Louis C. Sheafe. And so that eventually expanded into enough for a book about him.
So what was it that first initially interested you? Like you said that you were interested in it and you read some writings about him. So what was it that initially intrigued you?
It was in George Knight's biography of A.T. Jones. And he mentions that Louis Sheafe was pastor of a church. It was called the People's Church, which in itself was kind of intriguing. But that he had protested racial injustice in the church, and the congregation had gone independent of the organized work, if we can put it that way, and then had returned. And so I thought, I've never heard of this person, and it sounds very, very intriguing. And so I had my antenna out, put it that way, when I began the study on the first church history. And I was doing this just when sort of the online revolution, if I can put it that way, in terms of what's available full text.
Right.
And so I took advantage of that. However, I also had to do a lot of just scrolling through microfilm of old newspapers, going through boxes and archives. I love doing that. It's not real time efficient. But one thing that I mention it because what spurred my interest in Sheafe was that I'm going through this newspaper. It's called the Colored American. It was one of two Black newspapers in Washington at the time. And I'm seeing one or two little references to him. And then all of a sudden, boom, he's on the front page. And there's a 2-page article. And it's about a new faith comes, and it's stirring Washington, D.C. And I said, wow, this was something. And so that really then made me think, along with some things I was finding in the correspondence files at the General Conference Archives that just said, this is a significant figure who has been too much forgotten.
So tell us, so he was the pastor of the first church in Washington, D.C., and this was an interracial church. So tell us a little bit about what you know about them starting this church. And you said they went a little bit rogue for a while, and they came back.
Well, I should make a distinction between that church and then another one that Sheafe started in Washington through his evangelism called the People's Church.
Okay.
But he began as pastor of the first church and then planted this new congregation afterwards, which was the one that went independent.
Okay.
But the first church started off just the Washington church. There were no other churches in Washington. In 1886, at a time when Adventism was trying to finally make a dent in the cities. We had really done very little, but setting up city missions. And Washington was one of those. And by 1889, a congregation officially of 26, but it's really a little larger than that in terms of people attending. And it grows pretty well. By a decade later, it's got 150 members, which is a sizable congregation for that time. And about 100 of them are white and about 50 of them are black. And A.F. Ballinger, who is a revivalist who is there, the settled pastor was still only gradually coming in. But anyway, Ballinger was there for a few months, and he writes in his monthly report, the end of 1899, to the General Conference, this church is a miracle of the living God, composed as it is of the two races, and that the other churches recognize this and are amazed, impressed, I'm paraphrasing, by it. So that intrigued me, especially since this was a point in American history when segregation was being imposed more heavily and more rigidly than ever before, often referred to as the nadir of race relations in the nation's history. The Supreme Court approved separate but equal, 1896. The South officially codifies segregation. And attitudes nationwide really, scientific, quote, pseudoscientific racism, put it that way, becomes popular in the universities nationwide.
So you're talking about like eugenics and Darwinism and
there you go.
Okay.
Moving in that direction. And the idea that we want to reunify the country, heal the wounds of the Civil War, and bring the white nation back together, which means that, that's really at the expense of racial equality. So it's what's happening at this Adventist church in Washington, D.C. is flying in the face of that, and they're aware of it. A man named Karlstrom, a Swedish immigrant, he was the elder of the congregation, and he writes specifically, the world day by day is worsening the relations between the races, but we believe that I'm paraphrasing, but that equality is what God stands for, and we intend to do that in our fellowship.
I wonder, and maybe, some of the research that you've done can answer this, like, how were they really able to, like, to kind of meld their two cultures together in this church? I mean, how were they, what were some principles which kind of solidified their unity in the sense?
Well, my sense is that for a few years, they did succeed in having that type of fellowship. The other key figure in this was a black man by the name of James H. Howard. He was a physician, but his main employment was in the federal government. He had a relatively high position. He was the uncle of Eva B. Dykes, who would be much better known than he was. But he was a very eloquent voice for racial equality. and his spirit, I think, was sort of pervasive. In other words, he brought a lot of people into the church. Now, they were also very active in reaching out to the poor, various types of missionary service. But I would say that the evidence that there was a sizable group of both races that were committed to this comes most clearly when the pressure from the general conference level comes into split.
Mm.
And so then you have about half of the white membership does go and form a separate congregation, but the other half remains with this congregation, which now takes the name the First Church, because now there's a second one which became known as the Memorial Church. It's not to say it was easy. I mean, there are instances of marriages breaking up. For example, a wife just did not want to send her little girl into Sabbath school with all these little black boys, but her husband was dedicated to this, and she left him over it. So it was not easy. And, you know, it's a question of, well, could it have lasted given, and again, we have to realize, although today with the racial issue being so raw and tense once again, you know, we're very attuned to it, but still 120 years ago, at this point in our history as a nation, the racial divide is so stark. And Washington, D.C. is a little bit of a strange intermixture of North and South, but basically it's a southern city with southern mores. So this is so countercultural.
Wow.
Would it
So,
have lasted? But they really, again, maybe just real quickly, from the letters of Kallstrom and Howard, there is a theological, they're doing this because they believe this is what Adventism is all about. If we're truly going to be the last day church, following the commandments of God, the faith of Jesus fully, the Holy Spirit has to be powerful enough to conquer racism. I mean, they actually say words to that effect.
wow, that's incredible. I mean, when you think about the climate of what it was 120 years ago, and then so basically they were making this church more of a political statement. They weren't looking to be comfortable. They were looking to make a statement. And like you were saying, during this time, you had the separate but equal legislation passing. I mean, how did that, before that legislation passed, were more Adventist churches maybe on the road to being kind of like this Washington church? And how did that legislation then affect the way that Adventist churches began to congregate?
Yeah, that's an excellent and somewhat complex question, because at the same time you have another factor, and that is that the mission of Edson White to the South, going down on the Mississippi, the steamboat-based evangelism, encounters a violent reaction. So there is a growing sense that, well, for practical, pragmatic reasons like staying alive, we might have to adapt our idealism in the South over having the races meet together. So unquestionably, but that is all part of the sort of clampdown in this period, whereas after the Civil War, there was a period of fluidity, and that goes on even longer after typically what we call Reconstruction ends in 1877. But in the 1890s, this is really going the other direction. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was an attempt in the late 1890s to join the churches, the black and the white. it for didn't work. The details are not entirely clear, but the inference one draws is that the black people felt that they were still being regarded as inferior in this mixed congregation, and they, so that it didn't work there. I'm not aware of too many other examples where you have a large group of both races together in a congregation. It was very common. In fact, it was the norm for individual or small groups of black people to worship with the white believers in previous years. That was the norm. In fact, some historians like Kevin Burton and Benjamin Baker are finding more and more names of black Adventists that we didn't know about, and they were all they weren't part of a black church. They were just joining in with the church in their locality. This is in earlier decades now, prior to the 1890s. But when you have a pretty substantial group, that becomes more problematic. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about this first kind of interracial church that was popping up in Washington. One, what do you think the climate was? Because, just culturally or, for this to be able to form. But one, it also seemed like these were very politically minded individuals who said, we're here to make a statement. And then kind of what happened after some of the separate but equal legislation passed. Was this the beginning of the breakup of that church, or when did that begin to deteriorate?
Well, 1896 was the Supreme Court decision. And beyond that, this interracial miracle, if we can use Ballinger's language, did continue for a few years. So I think that they were not wanting to go along with that trend at all. This Dr. Howard that I mentioned, he was part of the educational and cultural elite of African Americans in Washington, D.C. I think this is an important point. Washington, D.C. had the largest concentration of black people of any city in America at that time. And it had a large educated class, better opportunities through the government for employment than most other places. And so from Howard's perspective, he says, look, Washington has many forward-thinking people of both races, which was true. And then Philadelphia, Baltimore, I think, was second or third, Philadelphia fourth in terms of black membership. And he had contacts in those cities as well. His perspective is, if we can show how Adventism handles this racial divide in a way that's truer to the gospel than the other congregations, that's going to be a powerful witness. What an incredible opportunity we have. So very connected with what's going on in society. Political, yes, in making a statement about the burning issue of the day. Not so much in terms of legislation and so forth, but in saying that we're not going to cave in, if you will, go along with the prevailing slide downward racially. There comes a new thrust for evangelism in 1901 and 1902, and that would be the catalyst for Sheafe coming onto the scene, for an influx of more members, and then things kind of get to a crisis point.
Okay, tell us about the crisis point. So Sheafe comes in during more of an evangelistic wave. Tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us about the crisis.
Yeah. Now, maybe I should back up just briefly on Sheafe. He was educated at a Baptist seminary in Washington, D.C., Wayland Seminary. he pastored in Minnesota and Ohio. While in Ohio, somehow he went to Battle Creek for treatment, and it's not even entirely clear what his problem was. But it seemed to be that periodically it might have been something like depression or nerves, whatever. He would periodically take these breaks from his pastorate, but he goes to Battle Creek, learns about Adventism there, and becomes an Adventist minister in 1896. He's ordained 2 or 3 years later, the third African American to be ordained to the ministry in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And he is, by all accounts, an eloquent speaker. John Harvey Kellogg said, we don't have a white minister that can begin to stand next to this guy.
Wow.
So back to Washington now. Everyone concerned recognizes that the racial issue is there in terms of evangelism. And in 1901, they had it, they're always evangelizing. I mean, every summer, and even more. But in their tent that summer, there was a lot of interest, Black people coming in to the meeting, but this time it was noticeably discouraging white attendance. So now they're gearing up for 1902. And the General Conference has an interest in this, even though, there's kind of some fluidity in terms of the development of the conference and union structure there on the eastern seaboard at this time. But so the General Conference is now willing to support a major evangelistic thrust in Washington, D.C. in 1902. And the idea was that we will bring in a white evangelist and a Black evangelist. And from the standpoint of A.G. Daniels, who was the General Conference president, this will be wonderful, because then we'll be able to separate this existing church and then have the new white converts in a white church and then build up a Black church. And he even went to Washington. He saw a lot of the great Black churches, AME, Episcopalian, Fourth Presbyterian was a major one. They're, man, these are fantastic. We can do this. Well, the white evangelist was Washburn. The Black evangelist was Sheafe. Now, Howard and Kallstrom there at First Church, their model on this was, yes, we need initially an evangelist of both races. But then as the new believers are brought in, they will be taught that part of what Adventism means is that we worship together. We're in one community and we treat each other equally, not to create divisions. So back to that newspaper that I found that was such an exciting discovery for me, in 1902, Sheafe is having a tremendous success. He has interracial, probably majority Black, but interracial audiences. And there is another report in the Washington Post where they said they set up 1,500 seats. More than 2,000 people attended. They're pressing in on the sides. It's a very vivid scene, white and Black. And so then you have him, and then you have Washburn, and Washburn is not hardly getting much attention at all. As a matter of fact, since he never actually reports any numbers, if he had numbers, I'm sure he would have claimed them in terms of new believers. But Sheafe's evangelism, eventually about 80, and I would estimate probably 15 to 20 of them were white. So he was actually baptizing more white people than Washburn was. But the General Conference, and by now you have, it's not yet the Columbia Union, but the Atlantic Union. Actually, this was in the Atlantic Union at that point, and the Chesapeake Conference are involved, but it's really driven by the General Conference. They bring the officials in September 1902 to effect the division of the church, and so that was a pretty traumatic thing, but it resulted in, as I said before, one white congregation, Washburn pastoring that, and then Sheafe was pastoring this mixed race church. And then to add significance to this story, in 1903, just less than a year later, the General Conference moves from Battle Creek to border of Washington, D.C., Tacoma Park, bordering on D.C. and Maryland. And now what's happening racially in Washington is seen as setting the, they use the term the right mold. This is the mold for the work that we'll be establishing here. So how this racial problem is dealt here with Washington is going to be something that our people can look to throughout the nation, even the world, as to how we handle this problem. Sheafe and Daniels work together. Initially, Daniels is very upset with Sheafe because he went along with the first church, the integrationists or the racial idealists there. But Daniels convinces Sheafe to start a new church, and this was called the People's Church. This was in December 1903. The first church continues as a mixed race congregation. The People's Church also has some white believers, but it's predominantly African American. So then we fast forward to the question of, all right, so now this is going to be our new center, and we're going to set up a new sanitarium here. We're going to show that we don't need Dr. Kellogg, because this is the controversy, the decade when that controversy is coming to a rupture point.
Wow.
And we're going to set up a school. So how is all of that going to relate to these believers? By 1905, about 150 in the People's Church, and maybe another 100 or so in the first church. Will Black Adventists, and I should say at this point, this is probably about 15-20% of the total number of Black people in the Adventist Church nationwide, are they going to have the same opportunity for education, for access to the healthcare, also employment at these new institutions? And so that combined with the fact that the General Conference had supported the white church under Washburn with a big fundraising campaign to acquire a church for him. When Sheafe and his People's Church, they're meeting initially in a rented hall. They need a building. They can't seem to get the General Conference to come together on this with them. So finally, Sheafe, just from his members, from contacts he has in the community, because he's earned a lot of respect in the broader community, they acquire a very nice building on their own. They have to finance it. Right. And so now they're saying, look, can you help us out just a little? You gave $10,000 for the white church. Can you help us somewhat? For whatever reason, it didn't come. It wasn't an absolute denial, but it seemed that other things were a priority. And so you put that with the fact then that not only are these Black Adventists dutifully returning their tithes and offerings into the centralized system, but they inquire, will we be permitted to use these institutions that are still being built in Tacoma Park, but they're just about to start? And the answer is a little bit evasive, but really what it comes down to is no, probably not. Wow. Well, what about money to set up similar institutions, maybe not on the same scale, but at least commensurate with the membership that is there. Well, again, it's kind of like, yes, we'll think about that, we'll work on it, but there was just a huge disparity there. So the People's Church in 1906 says, all right, well, can we then simply retain our tithes and offerings and administer them as we see fit?
Right.
Yeah, and there was no doctrinal issue. They they loved the Adventist faith. They were deeply committed to it, but they suggested that as a way of rectifying this inequity.
Yeah.
But organization, especially in this setting of the Kellogg crisis and so forth, keeping that intact was a very high priority. And so, this idea of a congregation retaining its funds, that was not acceptable at all. And so that led then to the People's Church withdrawing from the denomination in 1907
Wow.
and becoming an independent congregation, independent. Still call themselves Seventh-day Adventists, still use the Sabbath School quarterly, etc., but no longer part of the system.
Wow. Okay, I have some questions on this. Looking at the interracial church that was first started by Sheafe, it's called the First Church. Basically, what happened to this church after he left? Did it continue that trajectory? And how was the General Conference trying to, mingle in that? We'll talk about that first, and I have other questions about some stuff that you mentioned.
Well, when the General Conference moved to Washington in 1903, because of the complication of the race problem there, they set up something called the District Committee for the General Conference directly to administer the churches in the Washington, D.C. area. And so Daniels, I mentioned that to say then that Daniels really, although there's a committee that's handling it, he's really kind of hands-on quite a bit on this. And his conclusion is finally, especially after he sees Sheafe's success firsthand, an administrator loves to see baptism, and that speaks very loudly. And so Daniel said, all right, well, let's just let everybody do their own thing, so to speak. Black church, white church, mixed race church, blessings on them all. Now, I think that he believed that the mixed race experiment would die out gradually. That would be wiser just to let it alone. And probably if he was thinking that, he was correct, but it was not immediate. In other words, I think that one way of viewing this would simply be to say, well, it's just the typical fashion of what happens when the black presence increases. There's white flight, and that's just sort of the sociological law of things. But I want to say, no, there was a core of people for a few years of both races who put up a resistance against that and said, no, that is not the way of the gospel. It's a little hard to say exactly when the church significantly was no longer significantly racially mixed. But one way of looking at that is to say that for several years they refused to be designated colored. I mean, that's demeaning anyway. But they said, no, you can't classify us that way. But when the District of Columbia Conference forms in 1909, and reports in the Union paper start to appear and so forth, pretty soon you start to see that colored designation. So that would be, several years later. At least I can say definitely until about 1906, 1907, First Church still had a significant racial intermixture of both groups. but gradually there was attrition from that.
So I just want to wrap my head around this a little bit because I'm not familiar with this history, so it's interesting. So A.G. Daniels is, at first, he's really not on board with what Sheafe is doing. This is back in like 1902, and they asked him to leave and to start the People's Church. And then you were mentioning something like, okay, you had another minister who the conference was supporting financially, a white minister, but they were not willing to support Sheafe and the work that he was doing. What was, and they were so basically they were not allowed to use their own tithe dollars to support their community or to start institutions. The GC kind of gave them the runaround when it came to, can we have access to the same facilities that you guys are building? And they're like, nah, maybe, but no. And so the People's Church kind of just say, we're going to do our own thing, keep our own tithe dollars, support our own community, but we're still committed to the Adventist faith. A question about that period is, why did Sheafe initially agree to leave and start that church? What was the rationale behind handing over this other? Was it a church planting venture, or was it just did they not like what he was doing, or what was the catalyst?
So initially, after the initial division of the Washington Church, and so you have a white church of about 40 members, and then you have a black church that has, according to Kallstrom, 122 black and 46 white members. Okay, Sheafe's idea initially was, we're going to build this up. We're going to build this up, and a new evangelistic season is coming in 1903. But Daniels says, no, it would be better to start another church. It's not our way to build up huge congregations. It's better to have several congregations, or rather than concentrating the membership in one place. So I'm not sure it's clear exactly what Sheafe was thinking. It is clear that the members of the first church were disappointed. See, so your question, I mean, they're asking the same question. Why are you doing this? But part of it, I think, has to do with initial encouragement, at least, and promise of support from Daniels. And Daniels, even, he comes out and preaches sometimes. He's there for their official opening in the rented place in December of 1903. And it is with the idea that, let us make Washington, D.C. a center for the black work, so that we can set up a training school here. And this is perfect. This will be great. But as Sheafe persists, and continues his evangelism, continues building things up, then for reasons that might have to do with just continuing agitation from the first church idealists, it also, let me back up as things come to mind, Daniels was actually somewhat progressive, believe it or not, at least in relation to the rest of the General Conference Committee, because there was a lot of suspicion about Sheafe from the get-go. George I. Butler, the former General Conference president, now he's back in as the Southern Union president, and he says, Sheafe is just a Seventh-day Baptist. He's not really a tried and true SDA. And so they said to Daniels, what Sheafe is going to do is he's going to build up the following using the auspices and platform, metaphorically, of Seventh-day Adventism. And then when he builds up the congregation, he's going to take them and just, and so that made it difficult, I think, for Daniels. I don't think impossible. I think that if he really wanted to act decisively, that he could have. But he was able to say, well, the General Conference Committee is not ready to do this at this point, and, that type of language. So that then, after having this initial support and encouragement to build up the People's Church, then the financial aspect is not coming through.
Wow.
And so gradually Sheafe becomes more antagonistic. He tries, there's about a 2-year period where, it seems like there's an opportunity for this to work, where we'll have congregations that are predominantly of Black and white, and then the mixed race as well. But we'll work together, and just build up the cause on multiple fronts. But Sheafe's about 1905 when he has secured that building, and it's down on near the U Street corridor in Washington, D.C., which was the center of action. It was near Howard University, all the Black cultural institutions. It was perfectly positioned to reach Black Washington, and it had enough space at least to begin a school. They even started to print a periodical briefly out of there, and then he financed that all with his church members and getting other loans from the community and so forth, but nothing.
Wow.
And he writes to Daniels and he says, Elder Daniels, I wish that you would come out for the dedication. We're moving into this new building. This is in 1905. And he says, the people, he's referring to his church members, are asking me some questions that are hard to answer. Well, I don't know the details of Daniel's schedule, or how, quote, legitimate his excuse was, but he didn't show up.
Wow.
For that. Sent some other people. And so then Sheafe starts to be more insistent. It starts to be an either or type of thing. And eventually it leads to this breaking point that we talked about earlier.
Wow. So, and we talked about this previously in a conversation, and I wanted you to flesh this out a little bit. You were mentioning that before, the culture and the United States kind of made this hard line, separate but equal decision, that Adventists were in line with doing kind of the work that was happening in Washington, more of this interracial type congregation, and looking to really be that. But then after legislation passed, they actually became more in line with the policy. Is that correct?
There was an African-American scholar who was a Seventh-day Adventist. He actually taught in Adventist schools. He did not remain active, although he remained close to the church throughout his life. His name was Arna Bontom. And he's writing later, and I quote him because he says it so well, and he says that Adventism started out pretty well on race relations, but then they chose to appease the South. And he says, and they're paying the price for it. He's writing this in about 1950. So even though we see some examples like this group in Washington that are pushing back against it, by and large, is pretty much of an accommodation of the general trend of the society, so far as I can see.
And just a little clarity too. And you said that there was a crisis that happened, and maybe this was just the thing that happened between Sheafe leaving. But what was that crisis in 1902?
Oh, well, 1902 was the division of the congregations. But I think the real crisis point comes in 1906 to 1907 when the People's Church now sends a letter. I would call it a petition. Really, it's a protest action to the General Conference and saying, okay, are we going to be permitted to utilize the institutions that are being created in Tacoma Park? If not, what are the alternatives? And if there are no other alternatives, are you going to help us build similar institutions for our people? Or if not, finally, they said, we have the permission, your permission,
Right.
to keep our own funds and handle the challenges on our own, because actually they had done so thus far pretty well, although they certainly could use more help. And so it was kind of an ultimatum. In other words, they forced the issue. And so the General Conference Committee was forced to say, and Daniels actually, he did write it on behalf of the response, on behalf of the committee. And basically, it tried to say, well, we can't really answer your question directly because after all, Washington Sanitarium and the Washington Training Institute, as it was initially called, they have their own boards and so forth and so forth. But, that was so transparently disingenuous, because the General Conference leaders were the chairman of the boards of those institutions, so there was really no way that he could say, well, it's out of our hands. So the de facto answer is no, we're not going to, these are not going to be racially integrated. And then it's more like, well, for the time being, you can go up to South Lancaster, wasn't yet Atlantic Union College, but future Atlantic Union College. Of course, we have Oakwood. Hundreds of miles away in the deep South. We do need, they acknowledge, oh yes, we need to build up a good school and a treatment room. That was the term then used for a clinic, where you would do medical missionary work, and not a full-scale hospital, but you would, minor treatments and just a health center, so to speak, a treatment room, but nothing tangible, just kind of vague assurances that, well, we will get around to this, but not now. So then that leads to the People's Church then saying, all right, well, we will just go on our own as an independent congregation. Now, there is a lot else going on. And one thing is back to Kellogg, John Harvey Kellogg. Remember, Sheafe had come into the church through the sanitarium in Battle Creek and through Kellogg. And so Sheafe says, all right, we got young people. They want to take nurses training, whatever. You're not going to take them? Well, we'll send them to Battle Creek. And he went, he himself visited Battle Creek at that time because when the General Conference leaders would come out to speak, guest speak on Sabbath at the People's Church periodically, they were now so concerned about Kellogg that over and over they would be preaching loyalty, unity, and so Sheafe says, all right, well, I'm going to go to Battle Creek and see if I can find out if is Kellogg so awful as they say he is, and so forth. Now, that really
got under the skin.
yeah, because now it's like, all right, so Sheafe is in league with Kellogg and A.T. Jones, and they're going to start a rival denomination and so forth. Turns out that Sheafe did not really have any sustained alliance with Kellogg, but that was an exacerbating factor that made things come into this separation point then in 1907. Now, another thing that makes it a crisis is that, well, what about the First Church? Because although they didn't like the fact that Sheafe went to this other project of raising a separate congregation, basically they still supported him and they thought highly of him. And so then the question comes, well, are they going to join the People's Church in this? Is there going to be a separate denomination? After all, that's the typical pattern in American religious history. Sheafe visited James K. Humphrey in New York City. Now, that's another very important personage who would sort of do this part two 20-some years later. We might talk about that later, but he goes to other Black Adventist pastors here and there. And he doesn't really get that much support. And First Church hanging in the balance, but Dr. Howard, remember the leading light of that congregation, his counsel was, no, don't separate from the organized work, because look, the current leaders don't own it. It's not theirs. They make mistakes, but we shouldn't leave because of that. So, but if he had gone the other way, then you would have had about 20% of the Black Adventist membership, and momentum could have increased in that direction. Now, maybe I'll just quickly say that 6 years later, there was a reconciliation, but that ended up being short-lived. And so a part of the People's Church remained independent. Eventually, they became Seventh-day Baptist affiliated. But the other part of that congregation then that said, well, we want to stay with the organized work, they became what is today the DuPont Park Church in Washington, D.C. It's one of the largest, maybe, well, certainly one of the larger Black churches, and historically one of the main Black churches in Washington, D.C.
So after this crisis happened, what ended up with Louis C. Sheafe? Did he continue to pastor the People's Church? What did that reconciliation process look like, and why was it so short-lived?
At the 1913 General Conference session, they had worked out the deal in advance, but they had a nice public reconciliation there, and Sheafe says, okay, we admit that we were wrong in terms of not working with the Seventh-day Adventist system. And so the congregation comes back with basically with no preconditions, but with kind of word on the side that, yes, now we will start the school that you guys wanted and so forth. But part of the deal is that Sheafe will go to Los Angeles or go somewhere else. And that ends up being Los Angeles in 1913. But pretty soon there, some of the leaders in the Southern California Conference are starting to pressure him about the racial question and whether he believes that what Ellen G. White wrote in volume 9 of the testimonies that had some problematic things in it. Well, do you believe these, Brother Sheafe? Do you accept this as inspired counsel?
What was she saying? What was those?
Well, yeah, that opens up a whole another level of complication. But in volume 9 of the testimonies, you have a collection of things that are not well contextualized, and one of them was that, well, we have a number of talented Black people who can evangelize and teach and so forth, but for several reasons, a white man must lead. Okay. Now, again, as I say, these were not well contextualized as presented in the testimony. She's talking about a specific time and place, namely the South, and also till the Lord shows us a better way, it's better to have separate congregations. Other statements which, in the context of, say, Booker T. Washington, who was the major Black leader of that time, don't look so bad, but for someone like Sheafe, who was a fervent, passionate idealist on these issues, they fell short. And he said, now the thing of it is also, it's a mixed bag. Some of the things that she says there are just beautiful. And Sheafe, he says, this is like a Chinese puzzle to the fair-minded Christian. And if you have a very rigid, if you lack a sense of context, and if you have a very rigid view of how inspiration functions, or if in a context where that tends to be the prevailing assumption, then it becomes a challenge. And basically, Louis C. Sheafe, and another man by the name of John W. Manns in Savannah, Georgia, another Black preacher, they took the position that, well, actually, she didn't really say those things. And so now they start something called the Free Seventh-day Adventists. And pretty soon they break up. And Sheafe goes back to Washington. And he's back at the People's Church, but it's independent Seventh-day Adventist, eventually Seventh-day Baptist. And that's pretty much where he is for the remainder of his life.
So, and I know I asked you some questions and interrupted a bit. So when they were about to make reconciliation, he's like, I'm sorry that we guys should be a part of the institutions. And then some people began to question him about the questionable statements that Ellen White had made. And then was that the catalyst that led them to be independent again? Or what was the catalyst to make them independent again?
All right. So Volume 9 of the Testimonies was published in 1909. The reconciliation comes about in 1913 between Sheafe and the General Conference. He goes out to California. Now, however they worked out that reconciliation and whatever was said that's not preserved in the correspondence or committee minutes, Sheafe was acceptable. But somehow when he goes out there to California, then the people out there start pressing him hard on this. And it's like health reform. I mean, do you accept these statements about cheese? You know, this is the word of the spirit of prophecy. I think it's not far beyond that type of thing. So they make it an issue out there. In the meantime, though, back on the other side of the country, there's other pastors now, denominationally appointed pastors. They're part of the District of Columbia Conference. But they say now, the first chance they get, back then you had constituency or conference sessions every year. And so they go to the first one when they're back in what was then the District of Columbia Conference and said, all right, so let's get the school started, you know? And again, it's kind of like same thing.
A runaround, basically.
In the meantime, they're big fundraising for what is now called Washington Missionary College and Mount Vernon College in Ohio. And, you know, so separately, although Sheafe is kind of looming in the specter in the background, but separately, the People's Church on its own makes this departure, a second and final departure in 1916. And then you have this further split then of those in that congregation who said, wait a minute, we want to stay with the organized Seventh-day Adventist work. And so then they became the nucleus of one of the major Seventh-day Adventist congregations. And then the People's Church just, it really did not thrive, kind of held its own, but it lost dynamism in terms of growth or in terms of allying with other, you know, going into some kind of network or denominational fellowship that would be separate.
Was Sheafe, was he like maybe like a closet Adventist for the rest of his life, or did he himself like denounce Adventism in that way?
He didn't doctrinally denounce Adventism or nothing like, say, D.M. Canwright or whatever. And for a few years after he returns to Washington and resumes there at now the once again independent People's Church, the identity there is Seventh-day Adventist. They hold on to that for about 4 or 5 years. And in fact, Sheafe, in the autobiographical information or the biographical information that he gave for Who's Who in Colored America, he says that he worked for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists until 1921, when in fact it would have been about 5 years before when the second and final parting of the ways. But then in 1926, they affiliated with the Seventh-day Baptists. Now, at that point, he makes a statement that says, with the Seventh-day Baptists, we find a sense of freedom and a Christ-like spirit, which is kind of, by contrast with what we had before.
Yeah.
So there's some implication there that, he probably was not preaching what we call the three angels messages and the sanctuary doctrine and those types of things, but he never attacked the Adventist church. And he was a Sabbath. He held to that seventh-day Sabbath the rest of his life.
I hope this episode sparked an interest to find out more about the life of Louis C. Sheafe, as well as the challenges to his idealism and starting the first interracial church during the heart of segregation. Please stay tuned for next week's episode as we continue these conversations with Dr. Calvin Rock and Dr. Douglas Morgan on the history of the Black experience in the church. Recommended readings for this week include the biography Louis C. Sheafe, Apostle to Black America. We want to thank the Adventist learning community for making this program possible, as well as our guest, Dr. Douglas Morgan. If you're not already following us on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, be sure to do so at the handle @AdventNext. See you next week.